Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 18. Today we'll discuss strategies for paraphrasing. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your weekly homework document, as well as access to one scholarly source you plan to use for Project 3, your annotated bibliography. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll discuss the role of outside sources in academic composition. We'll define the term paraphrasing as a method for incorporating outside sources, and we'll discuss the rhetorical value of paraphrasing. All right, so up until this point, we have discussed a couple different ways that we can borrow from sources. So we've discussed direct quotes where we use word for word text from another individual, and we indicate that those words belong directly and explicitly to someone else by including the quotation marks. And those are kind of our visual cues that we are directly quoting someone. We also can use summaries, which provide a very brief, yet still importantly detailed account of a work in its entirety. Now, we want to see paraphrasing as a sort of comfortable medium between quoting and paraphrasing. So with quoting, we're really identifying a very specific part of a text, really maybe like 1, 2, 3 sentences that we find particularly important or relevant to our own writing. Whereas a summary gives us the opportunity to discuss the work as a whole. Rather than isolating a couple of sentences here and there, it really gets at what does the work in its entirety say. Now, like I said, paraphrasing is kind of a comfortable in-between. Now, this is when you put a chunk of another writer's text into your own words while still communicating the writer's original meaning. When we paraphrase, we don't isolate just a sentence or two, but we also don't use the entire text. Rather, paraphrasing gives us the opportunity to investigate and use in a more developed way, a section or perhaps a paragraph that you find relevant to your own argument or purpose. So in a sense, it's like quoting where you are isolating a chunk of text, but you're doing more than a sentence. Rather, you're doing at least a paragraph, if not an entire section. But of course, you are not obligated to account for the work in its entirety like you would with a summary. I really, though, love the explanation from the Purdue Owl. They describe it as your own rendition of essential information and ideas expressed by someone else presented in a new form. One legitimate way to borrow from a source, a more detailed restatement than a summary, which focuses concisely on a single main idea. So you can see here how you're sort of getting that precision that you would with a direct quote, but you have the ability to be more detailed in your telling of that chunk of text, but not as detailed as you might be if you were to use a summary. When we think about how to structure a paraphrase, it's very similar to how we would structure, whenever we're using another method to borrow from someone else. So we first want to begin by introducing the source. So in his recent article for the Seattle Times, Charles Kamasi ... So we have the name of the article and the full name of the author. We then want to follow with our paraphrase materials. So in his recent article for the Seattle Times, Charles Kamasi argues that because humans are prone to mistakes and misunderstanding, a partial component for civil discourse is maintaining humility. So recall when you read that article a few weeks back, he talks about several other things. So if we were summarizing, then we would be accountable for everything in that article and to discuss everything in that article. But perhaps maintaining humility is core to what we're writing on. And that's specifically the chunk of text that we want to borrow and incorporate into our own writing. And then, of course, we want to conclude this paraphrase with an in-text citation. So in this case, a partial component for civil discourses maintaining humility. Then we've got the parentheses, the last name of the author, and then the period. Now that's going to change based off of what style guide you're using. So for example, if we were using APA, we would include the year of publication after the author's name. Perhaps if this was printed in a physical newspaper as opposed to a digital one, we might also include the page number instead of the author's last name if we were using, let's say, Chicago or MLA. So keep that in mind. I oftentimes use MLA as an example for these types of lectures. So if you're using a different style guide, you do want to be aware that this is not the correct way to do it every single time. Rather, if you're using APA or Chicago, this might vary. When we think about the benefits of paraphrasing, we might wonder, okay, well, why would we paraphrase instead of summarizing or using a direct quote? In fact, what's interesting, I think paraphrasing is probably the most popular and common way to incorporate the works of another into our own. And there are several reasons, I think, for this. First and foremost, it allows you to make clear connection between your argument and your source's work. Because rather than just focusing in on a direct quote that may not provide a lot of detail, a paraphrase allows you to isolate an idea in its entirety without having to, explain to the reader in an unnecessary amount of detail, how the rest of the work may or may not be relevant, but rather it gives you the opportunity to say, okay, here's sort of a larger idea that I have. Here's how it is represented within a section of this text, and here's how it is specifically relevant to what I'm discussing. Paraphrasing also provides a better transition from a source's words to your own. Again, because you sort of have that balance of detail that you are obligated to include, it gives you a better opportunity to use necessary transitional statements to connect the source's work to your own. I also think that paraphrasing helps the writer in general gain a better grasp on another writer's argument, because by being able to focus in on one idea, you can, in a very specific way, say, okay, I understand how they are going about their methodology, or I understand how they're making connections between their initial idea and their final conclusions. And finally, it helps make larger connections to the text without having to summarize the text in its entirety. So going back to our example of Charles Kamasi's work, if you find that maintaining civility is really the bread and butter of, his work that connects to your own, then why should you have to explain the other tips that he discusses if they're not entirely relevant? That just distracts the reader, eats up space on your page that you could develop more toward your own original idea. So paraphrasing really allows you to get the appropriate amount of detail in there from another source without saturating or oversaturating your own work with their words that may or may not be entirely relevant to the argument you're making. Okay, so for the lecture assignment, I'd like you to select one source you plan to use in your Project 3 annotated bibliography. Find a specific section from the text that you believe speaks to your interest in the piece and paraphrase it using the strategies that we've discussed. For your weekly homework, you'll include the core Lecture 18 summary and assignment in your Week 10 homework submission. Overall, your Week 10 homework submission should include the summaries and assignments for core lectures 17, 18, and 19, as well as a mini lecture of your choice, and that is all due to the appropriate assignment submission folder on Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, October 27th. If you have any questions, or if there's anything you'd like to chat about in greater detail, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.